The Lurians, a small, mouse-like species, were once revered throughout the galaxy. Their intellect was unmatched, their advancements in science and technology indispensable to the prosperity of the Galactic Alliance. They were fragile, yes, physically weak and unassuming, but their contributions earned them a place among the most respected races. While others focused on conquest, the Lurians focused on knowledge. They were the quiet architects behind some of the most significant breakthroughs in energy, medicine, and communications across the stars. Then, the plague came. It started subtly, creeping across their homeworld of Lurix 5 like a silent, invisible predator. At first, it seemed manageable. The Lurians were no strangers to challenges, and their medical expertise was among the best in the galaxy. But soon, it became clear that this virus was no ordinary illness. It spread faster than anything they had ever encountered, leaping from city to city with terrifying speed. Entire colonies fell within days, and for every attempt the Lurians made to contain it, the virus seemed to mutate and grow stronger. Panic set in. The streets of Lurix 5, once bustling with scholars and scientists, were now filled with fear and despair. The Lurian leadership, once so composed and calculated, was desperate. They reached out to their allies in the Galactic Alliance, species they had aided for centuries, sharing their knowledge and wisdom. They pleaded for help. Medical supplies, quarantine stations, anything to stem the tide of this catastrophe. The response was silence. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from their supposed allies grew deafening. Then, finally, a response came. But it wasn't the aid the Lurians had hoped for. The Galactic Council, the governing body of the Alliance, announced that Lurix 5 was to be quarantined. No ships would be sent. No supplies would be provided. The Lurians were to be left alone, isolated, to contain the threat themselves. The reasoning was cold and calculated. The Lurians, though once valuable, were now seen as expendable. Their intellectual contributions, while significant, could not outweigh the risk of the plague spreading beyond their world. The Alliance, so focused on its own survival, had deemed the Lurians a liability. The Council feared the plague might escape Lurix 5 and infect their own populations. Sacrificing the Lurians was the safer option. The betrayal was swift and absolute. No ships left the neighboring star systems. No assistance came from their closest allies. Even the medical teams that had once worked side by side with the Lurians now retreated, cutting off all communication. The Lurians were truly alone. As days turned to weeks, Lurix 5 became a graveyard. The once brilliant cities now lay in ruin, overrun by sickness and death. Entire families were wiped out, their homes left abandoned, silent witnesses to the destruction. Those who survived hid in underground shelters, praying for a miracle, but knowing deep down that none would come. The skies above remained empty, no ships on the horizon, no beacons of hope. It was in this desolate moment, when all seemed lost, that the Lurians' last distress signals reached an unexpected audience, a group of human explorers. They were a small crew, part of a fleet that had been charting uncharted systems nearby. Their mission had nothing to do with Lurix 5, and the galaxy's major powers had long dismissed them as a minor, insignificant species in the grand scheme of things. But these humans had a reputation for acting on instinct, for ignoring the political complexities that paralyzed the larger races. Captain Arya Holt, leader of the expedition, received the distress signal late one night, while her crew was stationed in orbit around a distant moon. The signal was weak, almost entirely buried beneath layers of interference and static, but the message was clear: the Lurians were begging for help. Holt, unlike the Galactic Council, didn't see a risk in helping a dying race. She saw an opportunity to do the right thing. Despite the potential danger, despite knowing that aiding the Lurians might bring consequences from the Alliance, she made the call. "We're going to Lurix 5, she told her crew. They didn't argue. They didn't hesitate. The decision was unanimous. The small fleet changed course, heading straight toward the plague-ravaged planet, ready to defy the galaxy's indifference, and stand by a race that everyone else had abandoned. Humanity was coming. Captain Arya Holt stood on the bridge of her ship, staring at the data streaming across the console. The distress signal from Lurix 5 had been weak, almost lost in the cosmic noise, but it carried a message that couldn't be ignored. The plague had wiped out most of the Lurian population, and they were alone, abandoned by the very alliance they had helped build. Holt had heard the rumors of the Galactic Council's decision to isolate the Lurians, but seeing the desperation in their message made it all real. The rest of the crew watched her, waiting for orders. They were explorers, not medics or soldiers, and their mission didn't involve getting tangled in the politics of the Galactic Alliance. But none of that mattered now. Holt knew they couldn't just fly by and pretend they hadn't seen the message. "We're going in," she said, breaking the silence. Her crew didn't question the decision. It wasn't just about defying orders, it was about doing what was right. The Lurians needed help, and no one else was coming. As they approached Lurix 5, the devastation became clear. The once thriving cities were dark and lifeless, the planet's surface scarred by the pandemic. Sensors picked up a scattering of life signs, but the population had been decimated. The crew could feel the weight of the abandonment hanging over the planet. After landing, they were greeted by a small group of surviving Lurians. Fragile and cautious, they approached with hesitation, their tiny frames shaking with fear and exhaustion. The crew could see the toll the plague had taken. Eyes sunken, movements sluggish, these were a people on the verge of collapse. Captain Holt stepped forward, offering her hand in a universal gesture of peace. "We're here to help," she said, her voice soft but steady. At first, the Lurians didn't respond. Their trust in others had been shattered by the betrayal of their allies, and the sight of new visitors likely sparked as much fear as hope. But Holt's sincerity cut through the tension. Slowly, a Lurian elder reached out, barely able to lift his hand, but the gesture was enough. The bond had been made. The crew got to work immediately. Medical supplies were distributed, food was shared, and makeshift quarantine zones were established to limit the spread of the plague. The risk of infection was high, but Holt and her team didn't waver. They donned protective gear and began treating the sick, despite knowing that the plague had already killed countless others. Every precaution was taken, but the risk hung over them like a shadow. The Galactic Council's warnings came swiftly. A transmission arrived within hours, blunt and without sympathy. The message was clear: turn back or face sanctions. The Council didn't care about the plight of the Lurians. All they saw was a potential threat, an outbreak that could spread beyond Lurix 5, and humans who were foolish enough to get involved. They called Holt reckless, accused her of endangering the entire region. Captain Holt listened to the message and calmly shut off the transmission. She had no intention of following their orders. The Council had already abandoned the Lurians once. If humans were their last chance, then so be it. As days passed, the Lurians began to recover, thanks to the humans' intervention. The crew's constant efforts, administering treatments, reinforcing quarantines, and sharing knowledge, started to bear fruit. The plague hadn't been eradicated, but it had slowed, and some of the Lurians were showing signs of improvement. With every small victory, trust between the two species grew. The Lurians, who had once seen their larger, more imposing allies abandon them, now looked to the humans with something they hadn't felt in months: hope. Beyond medical aid, the humans provided comfort in ways the Lurians hadn't expected. They shared stories, listened to the Lurians' accounts of their once great cities, and even played music to break the eerie silence that had fallen over the desolate planet. These small, human touches, simple acts of kindness, brought a sense of normalcy to a people who had lost everything. The Council's threats continued to loom. Another warning came, this time with more serious repercussions promised: isolation from trade routes, the severing of diplomatic ties, even the threat of military action. The message was clear: humans had no place defying the decisions of the Galactic Council. But Holt wasn't interested in politics. Her crew stood by her, ready to face whatever consequences came. To them, the Lurians weren't just a race on the brink of extinction, they were beings who deserved to be saved, regardless of bureaucratic decrees. While the Council looked at the situation and saw a problem best left alone, the humans saw life, potential, and a chance to prove that compassion was worth more than convenience. They saw a species that could be saved, and even if the Council chose to condemn them for it, Holt and her team weren't turning back. With each passing day, the Lurians began to rebuild their fractured community. There was no illusion that the journey ahead would be easy, but for the first time since the plague had struck, there was a future worth fighting for. And it was all because humanity had chosen to step in when no one else would. By the time another transmission from the Galactic Council arrived, demanding once again that the humans cease their intervention, Captain Holt simply ignored it. She had made her choice. The fate of the Lurians had become intertwined with theirs, and she wasn't about to let a bureaucratic decree change that. While the humans continued to help the Lurians recover, a new danger began to stir in the distant reaches of the galaxy. Deep space scanners picked up faint signals, unfamiliar frequencies and energy signatures that didn't belong to any known race. At first, the signals were dismissed as interference, or perhaps remnants of long-forgotten probes drifting through space. But as the transmissions grew stronger and more organized, Captain Holt and her crew realized they were dealing with something much more serious. The Zargak arrived without warning. A mysterious and highly advanced alien race, the Zargak had been lurking in the shadows of the galaxy, waiting for the right moment to strike. Their technology far surpassed that of most known species, their warships sleek and deadly. The Zargak were opportunists, exploiting the weakened state of the galaxy. They saw the Lurian extinction as an opening, a power vacuum that they could fill, and Lurix 5, now vulnerable and isolated, was an easy target. The humans detected their approach first. They had been monitoring the situation closely, ever watchful since their arrival on Lurix 5. As the Zargak ships closed in, it became clear that the plague-ravaged world was about to become a battlefield. With the Galactic Alliance indifferent, the responsibility of defending the Lurians fell squarely on the humans. The Lurians, however, were not as defenseless as they appeared. For generations, their brilliance had been in the realm of science and technology. Though they lacked the physical strength or military might of other species, they had amassed vast amounts of knowledge, data on ancient alien technologies, forgotten galactic history, and untapped energy sources. This knowledge had been largely ignored by the Alliance, seen as irrelevant in times of peace, but now, with the Zargak advancing, it became a lifeline. As the humans and Lurians discussed the impending threat, the Lurian elders revealed something unexpected. Hidden within their archives was data about the Zargak, a species thought to be a myth, once mentioned in obscure historical texts. The Lurians had records of old Zargak technology, blueprints for ancient devices, and strategic insights passed down through centuries of scientific study. This information had never been considered valuable until now. Captain Holt realized that this knowledge could be the key to turning the tide. The Lurians, despite their small stature and frailty, possessed a treasure trove of forgotten wisdom that could give humanity a fighting chance against the Zargak. What had once been dismissed as scholarly trivia was now the cornerstone of their defense strategy. The humans began working closely with the Lurians, integrating their technological expertise into a unified effort. Together, they crafted new weapons and defensive systems, blending human resourcefulness with Lurian ingenuity. The bond between the two species grew stronger, not just in survival, but in shared purpose. The Lurians, who had once been left to die, were now vital to humanity's efforts to push back the Zargak. But technology alone wouldn't be enough. Holt knew the Lurians needed to be able to defend themselves. The humans began training the Lurians, teaching them guerrilla warfare tactics and basic combat techniques. While the Lurians weren't physically built for battle, their small size and agility made them excellent scouts and saboteurs. They learned to use their speed and stealth to their advantage, setting traps and outmaneuvering the much larger and more imposing Zargak forces. It wasn't easy. The Lurians had never fought a war before, and the idea of combat was foreign to them. They were a species of thinkers, not warriors. But desperation breeds adaptation. Under the humans' guidance, they began to find strength in their small numbers. They learned to rely on cunning rather than brute force, using their intimate knowledge of Lurix 5's terrain to gain the upper hand. As preparations were made, the Galactic Council remained silent. Despite the growing threat, they refused to acknowledge the Zargak invasion. For the Council, it was just another distant problem, far enough removed from their core worlds that it didn't warrant their intervention. Once again, the Lurians, and now the humans, were left to fend for themselves. Captain Holt and her crew knew they were on their own. They couldn't expect reinforcements or diplomatic resolutions. The Galactic Alliance had turned its back on them just as it had on the Lurians. But that didn't matter. Humanity had faced impossible odds before, and they would do so again. The Zargak were just another enemy, one that would learn that humanity didn't abandon its friends. The first skirmish between the Zargak and the Human-Lurian Alliance was inevitable. The Zargak ships descended upon Lurix 5, expecting little resistance from the plague-ridden world. But they were met with a force far more formidable than they had anticipated. Lurian engineers, working in tandem with the humans, had rigged the planet's old infrastructure with makeshift defenses, mines, energy barriers, and sensor jammers that disrupted the Zargak's advanced technology. Lurian teams, small and nimble, infiltrated the Zargak landing parties, sabotaging their equipment and cutting off supply lines. What the Zargak had expected to be a swift conquest turned into a drawn-out battle of attrition. The Lurians, once overlooked and abandoned, proved their worth in the heat of battle. Their knowledge, once dismissed as academic, became the very thing that gave them and the humans an edge. The humans, for their part, provided the muscle and leadership that the Lurians had lacked, turning their intellect into tangible results on the battlefield. Together, they managed to push the Zargak back in the first major encounter, an outcome that shocked even Captain Holt. The Lurians had shown remarkable adaptability and resilience, transforming from a helpless species into a key player in the defense of their world. The victory wasn't decisive, and the threat of the Zargak remained, but it marked a turning point. The Lurians were no longer the fragile victims waiting for rescue. With the humans at their side, they had become something more, an alliance that refused to be ignored, a force that would fight for its place in the galaxy. The sky over Lurix 5 was a dull orange as the Zargak fleet emerged from hyperspace. Their ships cast dark shadows across the horizon, a menacing force ready to crush what remained of the planet and its inhabitants. This time, there would be no probing attacks, no testing of defenses. The Zargak had come for total annihilation. Captain Arya Holt stood among her crew, watching the ominous display from the command center. She knew they were outnumbered, their combined human-Lurian forces a fraction of the size of the Zargak armada. But Holt wasn't one to back down. The humans and Lurians had fought too hard, endured too much, to surrender now. The preparations for this final stand had been meticulous. Human engineers had worked alongside Lurian scientists, fortifying the planet's defenses and upgrading their weapons. The Lurians had hacked into the galactic network, pulling every piece of information they could find on the Zargak, and used their collective genius to exploit weaknesses in their technology. The Alliance had crafted an intricate web of traps, shields, and guerrilla tactics, knowing that brute strength wouldn't win the day, but strategy might. As the Zargak ships descended, blotting out the sky, the Lurians worked tirelessly from their underground command center. They were not warriors, but their intellect had become a deadly weapon. While the humans fought above ground, the Lurians hacked into the Zargak's systems, disrupting their communications and sabotaging their ships. They used algorithms to scramble targeting systems, causing Zargak cannons to fire on their own forces. It was a new form of warfare, one fought as much with data as with firepower. The first wave of Zargak troops hit the ground, heavily armored and armed with advanced weaponry. The humans met them head-on, fighting with sheer grit and determination. Captain Holt led from the front, directing squads and rallying the troops. The battle was fierce, with explosions lighting up the landscape as both sides suffered heavy casualties. But the humans weren't fighting alone. For the first time, the Lurians were in the fray, using their small size and agility to outmaneuver the larger Zargak. Armed with lightweight plasma pistols and cloaking devices, they became ghostly figures on the battlefield, darting in and out of the shadows to disable enemy machinery or plant explosives. Their contribution was crucial, and it became clear that without the Lurians, the human defense would have crumbled long ago. In the midst of the chaos, several human soldiers made incredible sacrifices. Lieutenant Davis, one of Holt's most trusted officers, single-handedly took down a Zargak command ship by flying a stolen shuttle straight into its reactor core. His final transmission, a calm farewell, echoed through the comms as the explosion tore the ship apart. Another squad of human soldiers, outflanked and outgunned, held the line for hours, allowing the Lurian engineers time to activate a planetary shield that would repel the Zargak bombardment. Their courage, their willingness to go to extreme lengths for their allies, was a testament to the resilience and compassion that had defined humanity's role in this war. As the battle raged on, it became clear that the Zargak had underestimated their opponents. What they had dismissed as a dying world inhabited by a fragile race and a group of meddlesome humans had turned into their worst nightmare. The Lurians, once seen as helpless, had become the key to victory. Their sabotage efforts crippled the Zargak fleet, turning their own technology against them. Meanwhile, the humans' relentless defense on the ground held off wave after wave of attackers. In a final desperate move, the Zargak sent their flagship into the planet's atmosphere, intending to destroy the surface in one catastrophic strike. But by then, the Lurians had already hacked into the ship's core systems. As the massive vessel descended, its engines flickered and failed, sending it spiraling out of control. The humans watched in awe as the Zargak flagship crashed into the planet's surface, the explosion shaking the ground but leaving the defenders intact. The battle was over. Against all odds, the human-Lurian alliance had triumphed. As the smoke cleared, Captain Holt stood among the surviving soldiers and Lurians, surveying the aftermath. The cost had been high, too many good people had died, but they had done the impossible. They had faced an enemy far stronger than themselves and emerged victorious. The humans had proven, once again, that compassion, courage, and defiance could change the course of history. And the Lurians had redeemed themselves, proving that their intellect and skills were not just valuable but essential to the galaxy's survival. News of the victory spread quickly. The Galactic Council, which had once dismissed the plight of the Lurians and condemned the humans for intervening, could no longer ignore what had happened. The defeat of the Zargak had not only saved Lurix V but had halted what could have been a galaxy-wide invasion. The Council, now facing pressure from other species, was forced to acknowledge the importance of both the humans and the Lurians. There were no grand apologies, no formal declarations of guilt from the Council, but the shift in attitude was clear. The Lurians, once considered expendable, were now seen as a species worthy of respect. The humans, once labeled reckless for their defiance of galactic law, were hailed as heroes. The Galactic Alliance had been saved, not by the mighty fleets of its most powerful members, but by the compassion of a few explorers and the resilience of a once-forgotten race. In the days that followed, the Lurians began the long process of rebuilding their society. With human aid, they restored their cities and infrastructure, creating a new future for themselves. Their alliance with humanity had become more than a partnership of necessity. It had forged a bond of friendship and mutual respect that would last for generations. As Captain Holt and her crew prepared to leave Lurix V, the Lurian elders gathered to thank them. They had been saved not by the Galactic Council, but by a species that had seen their worth when no one else did. The Lurians, once on the brink of extinction, now stood as a testament to the power of resilience and unity. And the humans, true to form, simply nodded and prepared for their next adventure. They had done what they always did, defied the odds, fought for what was right, and in the process, changed the fate of the galaxy.